Resident Evil is known for having interesting stories behind the scenes, but what I find equally interesting is reports outside of the PlayStation. The Sega Saturn was a console that was hard for non-Sega developers to work with, and somehow Resident Evil had a port on the Saturn. Sure, it didn't look as good as the PlayStation or PC versions, but they made the game work and even added additional content. The Nintendo 64, which came out during the birth of the 3D era, decided to use cartridges instead of discs, which led to developers flocking to the PlayStation, and despite that, Capcom ported the entirety of Resident Evil 2 onto a 64MB cartridge with additional content. We could talk about the not one, but two Tiger Electronic ports of Resident Evil 2, one on the Gamecom, which ported Leon's campaign in its entirety. There would have been a Claire version of the game, but due to poor sales, that was cancelled. But the other Tiger port of Resident Evil 2 was released on this pocket-sized console that included link cables for a PvP mode, which sounds both chaotic and like... It's crazy. I'm definitely for it. Hopefully a couple millionaires could grab a bunch of them and host tournaments. The ball is in your court, Mr. Beast. I could even talk about the infamous mobile port of Resident Evil 4 and the even cooler VR port of the same game. But what I want to talk about is a port that we never got. The tragically cancelled Game Boy Color port of the first Resident Evil. Hot Gen Studios was chosen to helm the ambitious port, and their plan was to translate the entire game onto an 8MB cartridge with little to no compromises. While that seems insane for the mortal man, we have access to 2 prototypes, and based on said prototypes, they delivered and then some. These mad lads recreated the Spencer Mansion, its puzzles, and the horrors within it to a T. Before being cancelled, the game was planned to come out during the fall of 1999. This release will correspond with the other Capcom titles that were being ported to the Game Boy Color. These games were Street Fighter Alpha, 1942, and Ghosts and Goblins. Despite Hot Gen Studios going the extra mile, technical limitations would push the release to March of 2000. Fergus McGovern, the founder of Hot Gen Studios, went on to explain the hurdles that came while porting the game in an interview with GameSpy. McGovern went on to say that the Game Boy Color has some tight restrictions on the use of sprites that makes things difficult. The gameplay obviously has to change in some areas, but the moment you start playing, you know you're playing the same game. On top of that, McGovern and co. promised that not only would this be a 1-to-1 conversion, but there will also be a new enemy type and a pause save feature. This meant that you can just pause the game, turn off your Game Boy, and when you turn it back on, it will allow you to continue from where you left off, which is insane for the Game Boy Color. So why did it get cancelled? As March crept closer, IGN released an article on the 22nd breaking the news that the game was cancelled. Instead of speculating as to what happened, IGN cited a Capcom representative, so when asked the question of the hour, they went on to say that the game has been cancelled. We were not confident that the product would have made both consumers and Capcom happy. The article went on to state that other sources claimed that when Hot Gen Studios sent the finished game for approval, Capcom denied it. So the game was at one point completed, which makes its cancellation even more tragic. But in 2012, after a successful fundraising campaign, 2 cartridges that contained prototypes were found and dumped online. One of the cartridges contained an earlier build of the game, with Chris being the only playable character. The other cartridge had a build that contained 90% of the finished product, with both Chris and Jill's campaign. With some hacking, you can see the lab, but the nearly finished build only goes up to the entrance to Plant 42. I played both campaigns up to that point and recorded footage from the PlayStation, so let's see how Hot Gen Studios tackled the port. McGovern wasn't kidding when he promised a 1-to-1 port, because other than subtle changes, this is the same Resident Evil that the PlayStation offered. Of course, the CG cutscenes and the iconic cinematic opening had to be omitted, but almost all of the in-game cutscenes are intact, translating them into still images with text dialogue. Unfortunately, there's no Jill sandwiches, which sucks. Enemies such as the Cerberus, spiders, the snakes in the courtyard, and bosses are omitted, but you can still see Yawn's spray, which is cool. I'm honestly glad that they were omitted from this build, because the biggest problem with trying to convert a 3D game onto a Game Boy is draw distance. You could be pointing your gun at a zombie, but you're not going to deal damage unless you're turned a bit more. Which can lead you to taking unnecessary damage and dying over and over again. This is more of an issue with doing puzzles because interacting with things can be a hassle. For example, the picture puzzle needs to be done in a specific order, but the different camera angles are not accurate to what you're interacting with. So you can either be running around looking for the right picture or ruin the puzzle by mistake. The statue moving puzzle is frustrating because the game only allows you to move the statue where it's supposed to be placed, but when you leave to press the button, the other camera angle shows the statue away from the gas valve. There's no way to actually fix this, so it's a 50-50 chance as if the puzzle will work or not, and keep in mind, this puzzle can kill you. The bright side to this is that the save function works and it provides unlimited ink ribbons, so if you make sure to save before doing the puzzle, you'll be fine. The build also provides you with unlimited ammo, which prevents the issue of hitting enemies to be less stressful. Although health items are limited, so you still have to be careful with how you approach things. In the PlayStation version, you can shoot enemies from afar without having to actually see them, but there's no evidence of that working on this version. So you have to get close or close enough to enemies, which can drain your health pretty fast. I was able to find and use the shotgun, but when I got the grenade launcher I was unable to equip it, which sucks.
You don't have a weapon. Take this with you.
Wow, what an asshole.
The weirdest thing is that certain items are invisible, so unless you played the PlayStation version recently or have the game memorized, you could miss out on the broken shotgun for Chris's campaign. The keys work the way that they're supposed to, but some keys that are for the mansion look like the dormitory keys or the lab keys. The build even keeps the door loading screens, which misses a 1-to-1 port. I mean, even the status screen is here, and there's even a pixel profile picture. There were only 3 real differences, and those were: 1. When you're looking around the first floor of the mansion from Wesker, the game plays a short cutscene of Jill running around the first floor instead of allowing you to move around, which is cool. 2. There's no Jill sandwich scene, which sucks. And 3. In the area where you have to light a candle, the candle is placed on the left in the Game Boy Color version, while in the PlayStation version is on the right side of the table. Other than that, there's nothing really different about this version. I really wish I was able to see the lab and the ending of the game, but I had to hack it and I have no idea how to do that. Although, if you stay on the title screen for a while, you can see still images of other areas in the game that aren't accessible. The last thing that I want to touch on is the possible reasons as to why the port was cancelled. First of all, this was slated to come out in 1999, and then it was pushed to 2000. The first Resident Evil came out in 1996, so a remake coming out 3 to 4 years after the original didn't really make sense. If people wanted to play the first Resident Evil, they would have already. Even the Nintendo fans had Resident Evil 2 on the N64, and that port had files that explained the first game, so they didn't really need a remake at the time. Second of all, Resident Evil Code Veronica was coming out a month before the final release window for the port. Code Veronica was like the next generation Resident Evil title, so it could have overshadowed the port's release. Third and finally, despite the game being delayed, the game still had problems that could have hindered the overall experience, so Capcom probably didn't want to risk delaying it again, especially for a port to a game that came out 4 years ago. The cancellation of the game paved the way for Resident Evil Gaiden, which was made for the Game Boy Color and offered a different experience. I definitely want to cover it at some point because it's a pretty good game in its own right, but I wish Capcom allowed Hotchin Studios to fix and finish their game because it would have been the most ambitious game on the Game Boy Color. The only bright side is that we eventually got the first Resident Evil on the Nintendo DS with Resident Evil Deadly Silence, and we got a straight up port of the game on the PSP via the PlayStation Store. Weird thought experiment, but I wonder how it would have looked if the bosses went the way of the enemy counters in Zelda 2, where it shifts to a 2D plane. Imagine fighting Yawn or the Tyrant as if it was a Metroid boss or something. That would have been really cool, but it would have gone against their mission of making it a 1-to-1 port. But that's the story of the cancelled Game Boy Color port of Resident Evil. A game too ambitious for its own good, but something that should have came out. With Night Dive Studios remastering games such as Quake and Doom 64, it would be awesome to see them fix up the game and release it officially, of course with Capcom's approval, but if Star Fox 2 can come out, then this game could as well. Thank you all for watching. I'd like to thank my patrons, Leocrit, Hachi, and Retrowave for supporting the channel, and for $1 a month, your name can show up right here. Love you guys and shamalamamoomoo.